Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight we'll share quiet stories from Japanese Reddit, translated and retold slowly for sleep. Settle in, dim the lights, and let your breath find its own pace. Welcome, and thank you for settling in with us tonight, wherever you happen to be resting your head. If you have dimmed the lights already and pulled the covers a little closer, then you are exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we are going to spend just over 2 hours together in something close to quiet, moving slowly through 7 stories at an unhurried pace. These stories were shared anonymously on Japanese internet forums, places where ordinary people write honestly about the tender and complicated moments of everyday life. They were written without names attached, and without any expectation that anyone in particular would ever read them. They have been translated from Japanese and retold here in English, adapted gently for slow and easy listening on a quiet evening. You don't need to follow every detail, and you don't need to hold onto the thread of each story all the way to its end. These are simply voices drifting past you in the dark, carrying pieces of ordinary human experience from people you will never meet. A quiet misunderstanding between co-workers, a tension that settles over a family dinner table, a friendship that changed shape so slowly that nobody quite noticed when it happened. Some stories lean toward the workplace, some toward family, and some toward the small things people carry with them long after the moment itself has passed. None of them are meant to pull you sharply awake or leave you with something heavy resting on your chest at the end of a long day. This narration has been made with the help of AI, and the pacing has been kept deliberately slow throughout. There is room between the sentences for your breath to deepen and your thoughts to grow quieter and softer, one by one. There is nothing here that requires you to stay awake, and there is nothing you will miss by drifting off before the last story ends. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of the 3rd story, or the 6th, that is not something to feel sorry about. It is exactly what all of this is for, and the stories will still be here if you want to return. 7 stories, a little over 2 hours, and nothing asked of you tonight but to be still and to rest. Let's begin. Somewhere in the soft middle distance of memory, there is a city office at night, a single lamp burning on one desk while the rest of the floor rests in darkness, and rain moving quietly against the glass. This is a story from several years ago, told now the way one might tell it while sitting somewhere warm and still, with no particular hurry, only the wish for someone to listen. He was somewhere in his mid-20s at the time, someone whose stillness in any room might slip past a newcomer's notice, mild and unremarkable in the manner of still water. He was employed at a small advisory firm, the sort of place that made its living helping other businesses tell their story to the world, and he was, as it happens, genuinely good at what he did. Each evening, as the natural light left the windows and the office settled into its late rhythm, he would set down his work, straighten his small space, and leave at the hour the workday had named. The people around him had given this habit a name, in the way that offices always do, quietly, in passing, with the comfortable certainty of those who do not expect to be overheard. They called him the one who left because there was nothing left for him to do, the one whose work did not require him past the appointed hour. He heard this, as still people tend to hear most things, and let it settle the way one lets rain settle, without particular resistance or effort. The department head was a woman named EMI, and she was the kind of person who makes a room feel different simply by entering it, not through volume or display, but through a quality of presence that drew attention without demanding it. She was beautiful in the composed, unhurried way of someone who has never needed to announce herself, and she gave her full attention to whoever was speaking with her, which is a rarer quality than it might appear. She was also someone who believed, with the deep and sincere conviction of a person who has tested an idea in practice and found it to hold, that one grew stronger by reaching past what was already comfortable, that difficulty was the machinery of becoming. The office admired her for this, and they trusted her with their heaviest work, and the work accumulated on her desk the way things accumulate on a surface that has proven it will hold. The narrator, watching from his side of the open floor, had formed a quiet, private opinion that he carried without any particular intention of sharing. He thought she was carrying too much. One afternoon, perhaps an hour before the end of the working day, EMI called him aside with the composed directness of someone who has been deciding what to say and has now settled on saying it. She told him that she had been observing his habits, that she had some concerns she wished to share as gently as she could. She was careful to add, though gently did not, in this case, prevent her from being quite direct. She asked whether he had ever thought about advancement, about reaching for something more, about the particular satisfaction of becoming someone others could rely on and look toward. He replied, without defensiveness, that those were good ambitions for the people who wanted them, but that he had come to understand, through some honest years of self-observation, what he was able to do well and what he was not, and that he had chosen to work within those limits with care. He said, as plainly as he could, that taking on more than one could genuinely manage tended to produce, in time, the kind of errors that cost everyone around them, and that he thought this was the more important thing to consider. He mentioned, without wishing to wound, that greater responsibility brought the kind of weight she herself was carrying at that very moment. The silence that followed was not unfriendly, but it was the particular silence of two people who have been honest with one another and are deciding what to do with the honesty. She told him he was wrong about her, that she was managing well, and he did not argue. He only held her gaze with the patient, slightly sad expression of someone who has seen something they cannot take back from having seen. She asked, with a directness that was characteristic of her, whether he had any ambition at all. He told her that he was already where he had chosen to be. The conversation ended as conversations of that kind often do, without either person fully convincing the other, with things said that could not quite be unsaid, and a new and careful distance settling between them in the days that followed. And yet he found himself watching her, as he had watched her before, in the undemanding, peripheral way of someone who simply pays attention to what is in front of him. EMI began to miss the small rhythms that had kept her days human, the brief lunch with the colleagues she liked, the afternoon ease, the particular warmth of a floor that is doing well and knows it. One day, two of the women she was fond of came to her desk with bright faces and told her that the kitchen truck she loved had parked just outside, the one with the bento she had been ordering since it first began coming to this neighborhood. She thanked them, told them she was fine, and sent them out into the ordinary brightness of the afternoon while she turned back to her screen. The narrator went outside himself, bought one of the bentos at the truck, and sat in a nearby park to eat it, noting in the practical way of someone who pays attention to such things that the rice was warm and faintly sweet in a way that softened the afternoon considerably. When he returned, she was where he had left her, and the untouched hour of her lunchtime sat quietly in the back of his thoughts for the rest of the day. At 5 o'clock he put on his coat and walked toward the stairs. Near the stairwell, he passed two colleagues speaking in the careful, low-voiced way of people sharing something they are not entirely sure they ought to share. They were saying that the documents for a major client, a marketing proposal that had been months in careful preparation, had been caught in a miscommunication between departments, and that the revised version was now required by the following morning. They were saying that no one on the team understood the account well enough to assist, that the knowledge of it lived in a single person's memory and nowhere else. They were saying she would be there through the night. He stood in the corridor for a moment after they had passed, listening to the particular quality of the silence they left behind. He stood there a little longer than the moment strictly required. Then he turned around. He stopped at the bento shop. It had opened a small street-front counter that same evening, just around the corner, and he bought two. He rode the elevator back up and found her exactly as he had imagined she would be, surrounded by open folders, her monitor the only warm light on an otherwise emptied floor, her shoulders carrying the hour in a way that was visible from some distance across the room. He set one of the bentos gently on the edge of her desk and told her, in a tone that was straightforward without being unkind, that he had a sense of what was happening, and that if she would show him the materials, he would like to help. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see in her expression the complicated movement of someone who is very tired and very proud and has been offered, without warning, genuine assistance. She asked him why he had come back. He said that leaving when someone was clearly in difficulty, simply because the clock made it permissible to leave, was not something he found he was able to do regardless, he added, of what anyone had concluded about his working habits. She asked what he thought he could contribute, given that the account was specialized, and the content had been entirely in her care for months. He asked to see the file. She slid it toward him with the quiet resignation of someone too tired to explain why this probably would not work, and he began to read. It was the kind of structured analysis that came naturally to him, the sort of problem that resolves itself once you find the right way into it, and he found his way in without particular difficulty. He told her that if she worked on the presentation framework while he compiled the supporting documentation, they would very likely finish before the last train of the evening. She looked at him with the faint and careful trace of a smile and said that 30 minutes was a hopeful estimate. He agreed, and amended it to a goal rather than a certainty, and she told him, with something noticeably warmer in her voice than before, that this was the first time she had heard him use that word. They worked together through the still of the late evening, the floor emptied around them, the building's heating making its low and constant sound, the rain continuing its patient work against the glass. He moved through the data with a quiet efficiency, and she found herself watching him for a moment before returning to her own portion of the task. He did not speak often, but when he did, it was to point to something useful, and she found this restful in a way she had not anticipated. The documents were finished in a little over the time he had named. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screen and was quiet for longer than the moment seemed to require. Then she said that she had forgotten what it felt like to work beside someone, that it had been a long while since she had done so, and that the difference was larger than she had remembered. He told her that all the knowledge had been hers all along, that he had only helped to arrange it into its final shape. They ate the bentos then, quietly, in the darkened and empty office, the city lights beginning their slow, soft conversation with the rain-washed glass of the windows. She mentioned that she had been meaning for months to go inside the shop the truck belonged to, and had simply never found the time. He said something mild in response, and she laughed, the natural, unguarded laugh of someone who has relaxed for the first time in several hours, and the sound of it settled into the room like something warm. The following morning, EMI arrived with the deliberate and careful movements of someone whose body, having survived the worst of it, had decided to present a full accounting of its accumulated weariness. He found her before the day had properly begun and told her, plainly, that the presentation was not something she should attend that morning. She said that she had to go. He said that he would go in her place. The colleagues who were nearby and happened to overhear were quiet for a moment with the collective, careful doubtfulness of people who have formed a fixed picture of someone and are being asked to look at it differently. He waited without responding to any of this, and looked only at EMI, and she studied him for what seemed like several careful minutes, and then she nodded slowly and said that she was placing it entirely in his hands. The presentation went well, the client received it warmly, expressed their satisfaction, and said, with the directness that people use when they have found someone they are inclined to trust, that they had long worried about EMI, that she had always seemed to be managing too much entirely on her own, and that it was a relief to see she had someone near her. He had not expected to be affected by this, but he was. EMI rested for a few days, and when she returned she was a slightly lighter version of herself, not diminished, but less burdened, as though she had set something down and, for the first time in a long while, decided not to pick it back up. She gathered her team and thanked them, and she said, in the honest way she did most things, that she had been trying to hold the work alone, and that this had not been a form of strength she intended to continue, and that it was time to share the weight. The team responded in the warm and open way that people respond when someone they admire is honest with them first, and they made promises to one another that the days that followed showed they intended to keep. She found him afterward and thanked him, simply and directly, one person to another, without the formal distance of hierarchy. He told her, as he had told her at the time, that all of it had been hers all along, that her months of careful preparation had been what made the contract possible, and that he had only helped carry it over the final distance. She smiled at him, a full and unguarded smile, the kind that arrives without deliberation, and he found himself looking away, and she found this quietly funny, and laughed again. She said that she had first thought of him as someone who kept the world at deliberate distance, indifferent, perhaps, or simply at peace with remaining unseen. She said that the night in the office had shown her something different, and that she was glad she had been there to see it. Things between them shifted in the slow way that important things shift, without a single visible moment of change, the small days accumulating their work the way rain accumulates in a courtyard, gently and without announcement. They began to consult each other on small matters first, then larger ones, and then the kind that had nothing to do with the office at all. He found himself interested in problems he had not previously thought of as his to care about, and she found herself allowing for a slowness in certain things that she had previously called indulgence and was beginning to understand as something more like wisdom. The people around them noticed, as colleagues always do, and the floor grew warmer, the working day a slightly lighter thing to move through than it had been before. One evening, as the office was quieting into its end and the last of the day's light was moving away from the windows, he asked her whether she would like to have dinner with him sometime, not with the team, he clarified, but with him. He said it plainly and then looked at the floor, and she moved a little closer to him and told him that yes, she would like that very much, that she had been finding herself, for a while now, simply wanting more of his company. She said that he was the kind of person who surprised you by being better than your first impression had allowed for, and that those, in her experience, were the people worth knowing well and for a long time. They had dinner, and then other dinners, and then trips taken without hurry through the quieter parts of the country, moving through long weekend mornings and unhurried evenings the way two people move when they have stopped wondering whether this is where they are supposed to be. Some years later, on a calm and unremarkable evening, they told the office they had married, and the room received the news with the particular warmth of people for whom this was a confirmation of something they had already quietly known. He said, afterward, in the way people say things that have been true for a long while before the words arrive, that she had changed the color of his world, that before her it had been sufficient, complete in its own measured way, and that after her it was simply more. She had not remade him, only shown him a part of himself he had not thought to look for. The rain continued its patient work against the windows of the city they called home, the office lamp burned on in the warm middle distance of memory, and the night held everything gently, without expectation or demand. And that is where this chapter rests, for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, with its quiet shadows and the soft weight of everything that was said and everything that wasn't. There is no hurry now. If you need to, take a slow breath in, and let it go just as slowly. The night is still, and you are safe, and there is nowhere else you need to be. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle place, unhurried, the kind of story that drifts like smoke on a still evening. But first, just rest here for a moment. Let the silence settle around you, soft and warm, like something familiar you almost forgot you knew. Somewhere in the lower floors of a mid-sized company in the city, on a morning that was still new and mild with the particular softness that early spring gives to urban air, a young man named Kenji arrived for the first day of his new employment, his bag neat at his side, his coat still cool from the commute. He had prepared with care, as one does for first days. The suit was pressed, the shoes were clean, the documents were ordered in their folder, and he walked through the main entrance with the quietness of someone who has decided, at least for now, to take up only as much space as is necessary. The office was already full of the ordinary sounds of a working morning: keyboards, the soft percussion of file drawers opening and closing, voices kept to the measured pitch that open-plan spaces require of everyone who works in them. The new hire orientation was led by one of the assistant supervisors, and when she was introduced to him, he noticed, along with everyone else in the room, he suspected that she was the sort of person whose presence tends to organize the space around it, drawing attention without seeming to seek it at all. Her name was Mai, and she moved through the office with a settled ease that spoke of long familiarity with the space, with the work, with the particular social mathematics of a Japanese company, where relationships are calibrated carefully and maintained with a kind of dailiness that outsiders sometimes mistake for something more formal than it is. She was thorough in her work, consistently warm with every person she encountered, from the most senior director down to the newest administrative staff member, and she was, by any ordinary measure, exactly the kind of colleague one hopes to find on a first day, someone who makes an unfamiliar space feel, if not yet like home, at least like somewhere one might eventually belong. Her father held a position on the company's board of directors, as Kenji learned in passing that first morning, though this fact seemed to sit on her no more heavily than any other piece of biographical information. She did not mention it, did not lean on it, moved through her work with the same steady self-sufficiency she would have brought had her family had nothing to do with the company at all. And yet, from the very first moment he saw her across the conference table, there was something in his perception of her that would not settle, a faint quality of wrongness that he could not locate or name, the way a note played very slightly flat can be heard without being immediately identified as the source of one's unease. Nothing she did, nothing she said, nothing in the way she carried herself provided any solid reason for the feeling, and so he set it aside, as one does with impressions that have no evidence to anchor them. That evening, the department gathered for a welcome dinner at a nearby izakaya, one of those low-ceilinged, wooden interior establishments where the evening begins with introductions and gradually softens into something more informal, the pace of conversation slowing to match the pace at which small ceramic cups are refilled from the table's communal bottles. The seating arranged itself by chance, and Kenji found himself facing Mai across a narrow table, their faces at nearly the same level above the low surface, the sounds of the restaurant moving around them, orders called toward the kitchen, the hiss of something on the grill at the back, a door sliding open to let in a brief ribbon of city air. He made conversation as the situation required, the usual first evening small talk, the safe topics of the neighborhood, the commute, the food, whether everyone had found the place without difficulty. With the others at the table, Mai responded easily, her voice carrying that warm, unhurried quality, her face open and engaged, leaning forward slightly when she laughed. But when she turned her attention toward him, something shifted in a way that was subtle but not invisible, a slight tightening at the edges of her expression, a brief hesitation before her words arrived, a quality of careful management in the conversation that had not been there a moment before when she had been speaking freely with the colleague beside her. She was not rude, not in any way that could be named or reported, the form of courtesy was fully intact, every word correctly deployed, every pause appropriately timed, but the ease was absent, replaced by something that felt like the effortful maintenance of a surface under mild but consistent pressure. He noticed this and chose not to remark on it, setting it in the same quiet place he had set the morning's unnameable impression. The evening continued, the cups were refilled, and the talk at the table moved in the familiar circular way of such gatherings, touching on work and then on personal things and then circling back again, and at some point in the middle of it all, Kenji reached across to refill her glass with beer, a gesture so reflexive and ordinary at a Japanese drinking table that it had not crossed his mind to hesitate before making it. In the moment that followed, before he had fully registered what was occurring, her hand moved, and the sound of the contact was brief and very clear in a brief space of silence before the room's noise resumed. The table went still for the length of a breath, and then everyone seemed to speak at once. She was in tears before most people had finished asking what had happened, not the composed, controlled kind of crying that can be managed in public, but the other kind, which arrives when the body has been holding something under sustained pressure for a very long time and suddenly finds that it cannot continue to do so. She apologized with an intensity that went far beyond the proportions of what had occurred. She lowered herself toward the table in a gesture of genuine contrition, her voice fragmenting as she said that she did not understand, that her hand had moved before her mind had caught up with it, that she was sorry, deeply sorry, in a way that seemed addressed to more than just him or just the moment. Kenji told her, quietly, that he was not hurt. He told her honestly that there was no mark, that he did not hold it against her, and that she should not distress herself further on his account, all of which was true, and all of which he said because it was true, though it was also what the situation required him to say. A senior manager stepped in with the quiet practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to smoothing the small collisions of office social life, offered a calm word to each of them in turn, and the evening eventually found its equilibrium again, the last dishes cleared, the final cups finished, the group drifting out into the spring evening. From that night forward, Mai avoided him. She did not conceal this avoidance. In fact, she stated it plainly to the colleagues who asked, saying that the distance was entirely on her side, that Kenji had done nothing wrong, that it was a personal matter she was not able to explain at present. This candor, unusual as it was, had the effect of protecting him from the social consequences that might otherwise have followed being so visibly distanced by a senior colleague. People did not assume the worst of him. His working life at the company proceeded without complication, and the strange and specific tension between the two of them became simply one of the ambient conditions of his daily existence. Still, its shape was present and noted every day. Their interactions were reduced to the minimum that shared professional space allows: a forwarded document, a brief acknowledgement in a shared thread, the occasional necessary exchange conducted in a tone of perfect correctness that said nothing beyond what the words themselves were required to say. Even those minimal exchanges sometimes faltered in small ways, a reply arriving one clause shorter than the context would have warranted, a moment of eye contact failing to complete itself, the small and repeated malfunctions of two people occupying the same space while maintaining, by sustained effort, as much distance as the geometry of the space will permit. He adapted to it as one adapts to the permanent features of any environment, not with ease or pleasure exactly, but without excessive resistance, the way a person eventually learns to step around the particular uneven stone on the path between the station and their building without breaking their stride. A full year passed in this arrangement, the seasons cycling through the office windows, the humid weight of summer with the constant low undertone of air conditioning, the briefer and gentler days of autumn, the dry cold of winter mornings when the train platforms were very crowded and everyone stood close together and no one spoke. Throughout all of it, the space between them remained precisely what it had established itself as in those first days: maintained, stable, not hostile, not warm. He did not try to close it. He had come to understand, in the way that people do who pay a particular kind of attention to others, that there are interior conditions in people that do not belong to anyone else regardless of proximity, and that pressing against such boundaries tends to reinforce them rather than dissolve them. And so he worked, and the seasons moved, and Mai remained exactly at the edge of his professional peripheral vision present, and consistently not quite reachable, like a light seen through fog that neither brightens as you approach it nor fades as you move away. It was on an otherwise unremarkable morning in the following spring that a conflict in the department calendar arranged for the two of them to travel together, an overnight business visit to a client in another city, a few hours away by train, the kind of trip that is too brief to feel like a true journey but too long to feel entirely casual. The senior staff who would ordinarily have accompanied either of them were occupied with other commitments that could not be rearranged, and there was simply no configuration of available personnel that fit the calendar, which is to say, the situation arranged itself without asking anyone's permission, and both of them accepted it without comment. Kenji boarded the Shinkansen that morning with the particular self-possession of someone who has decided in advance to let the day be what it is, and he took a seat several rows behind hers and watched the city give way to the familiar countryside, the wide flat agricultural stretches, the occasional cluster of rooftops, the mountains holding their permanent position at the pale edge of every landscape. The rhythm of the train was slow and steady, the kind that makes thinking come easily at first and then gradually loosen, the way a long, slow breath releases both attention and effort at the same time without quite deciding to. The client meeting occupied the afternoon, and both of them moved through it with the seamlessness that comes from working in the same environment long enough to share its professional reflexes, presenting materials, answering questions, navigating the particular social rhythms of a Japanese business meeting where what is said and what is meant sometimes occupy adjacent but slightly different channels. The client took them for dinner afterward at a counter-seating restaurant in a narrow side street, the kind of place that has been doing the same thing for a long time without needing to announce itself, where the preparation is quiet and considered and each dish arrives as though someone has been thinking about it. They were a party of 4, and then a message came for the client, something requiring their attention elsewhere, and then they were 2, with an open bottle of sake and the last courses still to come, in a restaurant that had grown quieter around them as the evening progressed. They stayed because leaving before the meal was finished would have felt impolite, and because the food was genuinely good, and because there is something in the atmosphere of a quiet Japanese restaurant late in an evening that makes the option of remaining where one already is feel, simply, like the right one. They talked about work, at first the meeting's outcome, the report that would need to be drafted before they returned, the small professional matters that keep a conversation between uncertain acquaintances on level and familiar ground. But the sake softened the edges of the conversation the way sake tends to, slowly and without drama, and after a time the work talk ran out and a different kind of quiet settled over the counter, the kind that is not uncomfortable but is very present, that makes the sounds of the restaurant, a cup being set down, the low exchange of the staff, more audible than they were before. She began to speak about something other than work. She spoke without quite directing her words at him, in the unfocused way that sometimes comes over people who have been carrying something for a very long time and find themselves, almost by accident, in a situation with low enough stakes to let some of it surface without quite intending to. She spoke about the effort of things, maintaining the version of herself that was presented at the office each morning, the consistent warmth, the careful attention, the performance of someone for whom everything was, at all times, managed and under a kind of deliberate and sustained control. She spoke about the particular loneliness of being very good at something because one has had no other choice but to become good at it, and the fatigue that accumulates in the long intervals between those moments when one is genuinely permitted to rest. Kenji listened without offering anything in return, the way one listens when what is being said is not looking for a response but for something simpler, a witnessed presence, an acknowledgement that the words have been received without being deflected or improved or redirected. Somewhere in the middle of the evening, the tone shifted, and she began to say things that were oblique and strange observations about him specifically, about the way he sat, the way he looked at people, a quality in the particular steadiness of his attention, none of them complimentary, none of them entirely the opposite, more like the careful, sideways circling of something she had been trying not to approach for a long time. He did not respond to these observations either. He offered only the small, minimal sounds of continued attention, the murmured acknowledgments that keep another person's voice from stopping when it needs to continue, and she spoke for a long time in this way, the restaurant emptying further around them, the staff moving with decreasing frequency, the city continuing its ordinary life outside the rain-streaked window above the counter. Eventually the words slowed, then stopped, and she sat for a while in the particular aftermath of speech that has traveled some distance, quieter than before, something slightly loosened in her posture, the sake cup resting between both palms. He settled the bill, helped her find her coat where it had been folded over the back of her seat, and they went out into the night, the city outside damp with the fine spring rain that falls on Japanese cities in that season, not heavy enough to require shelter, just present everywhere, a mist that caught the light from the shop signs and gave the wet pavement a soft and blurred quality, as though the edges of things had been allowed to relax. The hotel was nearby, and they walked along streets that were quiet at that hour, their footsteps marking their unhurried progress through the mist, the rain continuing its gentle and indifferent work on everything around them, the way rain does, without preference for what it touches. He walked her to her door because it seemed the natural thing to do, and stood in the hallway as she found her key, thinking that the evening had come to its natural end. She stood at the door without moving for a moment that was slightly longer than the ordinary pause before opening a door, and then she said his name, and she asked him to wait. What she showed him then was not something she would have shown to anyone lightly, and he understood this with an immediacy that required no conscious processing. The understanding arrived before the mind had finished taking in what the eyes were seeing. Across her skin, her back, her sides, the areas that her clothing would never fail to cover in any ordinary day, were the marks of a history that the body had not been permitted to forget, the kind of evidence that time can soften but not entirely erase. There were burns, old and fully settled into the texture of the skin, and the narrow pale lines of healed cuts, and at her collarbones the subtle raised irregularity that comes when bones have broken and healed without being properly set, the kind of detail that, once seen, cannot be filed away. She showed him all of this without expression, moving slowly, with the particular composure of someone who has spent considerable time rehearsing a moment they both dreaded and could not stop themselves from eventually needing to reach. When she sat down again, she spoke asking, in a flat voice that carried the echo of something long submerged, whether he supposed any man could look at such a body without being turned away by it, whether anyone could find in such marks anything other than a reason for distance. And then she gave a short laugh, and the laugh carried no pleasure, only the strange relief that sometimes arrives when a thing one has feared saying has finally been said and the feared thing has not yet been confirmed. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, simply, directly, without arrangement or performance, that it sounded as though things had been very hard for her. The laugh stopped. Her face moved through something that was difficult to read precisely, the kind of expression that appears when a person has prepared themselves carefully for a particular response and the response they receive is an entirely different one, leaving the preparation with nothing to do and nowhere to go. She told him to go away. And then she struck him again, this time from somewhere deeper and older than the izakaya impulse, from the place in a person where language has not yet reached and perhaps may never, where only the body knows how to speak the oldest accumulated things. He stood in the corridor afterward, the hotel's quiet systems moving around him, the low breath of the ventilation, the distant tone of an elevator reaching its floor, and he stood there for a while, not thinking anything in particular, simply letting the evening settle into whatever shape it was going to take. He began, very slowly, to feel the shape of the past year take on a different meaning than the one he had assigned to it. There was something about him, some quality of observation, some particular way he had of looking at people that she had sensed from the very first morning, something that had told her, at a level beneath language, that he was the kind of person who might see through to the things she most needed not to be seen. He did not yet have the full words for this understanding, and he did not try to make them come faster than they were inclined to arrive. He returned to his own room, set his jacket over the back of the chair by the window, and lay down in the dark, listening to the rain against the glass, a small, steady sound, the kind that asks nothing of the listener and continues whether or not it is attended to. The city moved outside, indifferent and ongoing in the way that cities are, the lights diffused by the rain into soft and overlapping circles, the sound of it all reaching him very faintly through the glass as a kind of continuous gentle presence. There would be a morning, and a train home, and an office waiting to receive them both as it always had, and the story would continue in the slow and patient way that such stories do, not hurrying toward any conclusion, simply moving, one day following the next, carrying what it carried, setting down nothing before its time. For now, though, there was only the rain, and the dark, and the particular quietness of a late hour in an unfamiliar room, which is one of the more peaceable kinds of solitude that a person can find themselves in, if they are willing to let it be quiet. And somewhere down the hallway, behind a closed door, in the particular silence that follows a moment that has gone differently than one had planned or feared, the evening was settling in its own way, finding its own kind of rest. And that is where the chapter rests, for tonight in the rain, in the city's soft light, in the long pause between what was shown and what was, in time, slowly understood. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its quiet shadows dissolve like breath on a winter window. There is no hurry now. If you need to rest a moment here, in this soft space between stories, please do let your shoulders settle a little deeper, let your breath find its own slow rhythm. The night holds plenty of room for stillness. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle thing, worn smooth by time, the way a river stone is worn smooth without ever losing its weight. We will get there together, unhurried, the way all memories worth keeping eventually find their way back to us. She remained where she was for a long while after the call ended, standing in the small room where so much certainty had gathered over the past months, the lamp burning low on the side table, the phone loose in her hand, the silence settling around her like something soft and very heavy. The rain had come at some point during the evening, a gentle and unhurried rain of the kind that arrives in the latter weeks of May without announcement, and she could hear it now against the window glass, a continuous and even murmur that asked nothing of her. She set the phone down on the low table and looked at it for a moment, the way one looks at something small and unremarkable that has nonetheless altered the character of a room simply by being placed there. Her hands were very still in her lap. She noticed this with a mild and floating quality of attention, the way one notices the color of a wall when the mind has gone somewhere else entirely. Slowly, she sat down on the tatami, her legs folding beneath her, her shoulders lowering by degrees, the whole of her settling into a stillness that was not quite calm but was the nearest available thing to it. He had said that he was at his former girlfriend's home, and those words, simple as they were, held within them a shape she had not yet finished understanding. The days of silence, those several days during which his phone had rung and rung in some unknown room and no one had answered, the days during which she had called his parents and heard the quiet worry in his mother's voice and had told herself that it was all some harmless confusion, those days now had a different meaning. He had not been in an accident. He had not been unwell. He had been with her, the woman whose name Yuki had heard spoken perhaps twice in the years they had known each other, the woman who existed at the margins of his past like a watermark visible only when the paper was held to the light. She had thought, in those days of waiting, that she was afraid for him. She understood now that she had been afraid of something else entirely, something that had no name yet but was already present. The rain continued outside the window, even and soft, and she listened to it and allowed the next thing to enter her. The fact that the wedding was to be cancelled, that this had been his purpose in calling, that everything, the venue, the dress, the arrangements, the careful weeks of preparation, was now to be set aside as though it were a plan that had simply not worked out. He had said this without particular distress, and the lightness in his voice had been the strangest part, the detail that she kept returning to as she sat on the floor with her hands still in her lap. There was more that he had said, and it had come toward the end of the call, after the announcement and before the silence that followed, and she was not yet ready to think about it directly, so she held it at a small distance and let the rain speak for a while instead. At some point she rose and went to the kitchen, and she filled the kettle and set it on the burner, because the small ritual of making tea was something her hands knew how to do without requiring her full attention, and she needed her full attention for something else. The kettle ticked softly as the water warmed, and she stood beside it with her arms folded loosely across her chest, looking at the pale light of the kitchen and letting the thing he had told her find its proper place within her understanding. He had said, and here she allowed herself to think it plainly, that he had entered into the arrangement with a purpose that had nothing to do with her. He had thought, he said, that if he were to be seen taking part in an arrangement, if word were to reach his former girlfriend that he was engaged, she might feel something, might feel the pull of what she had once held and no longer did, might say the words he had been waiting to hear. And so there had been a plan, of a kind, loose and perhaps not even fully articulated to himself, but a plan nonetheless, and she, Yuki, who had met him through the careful and old-fashioned process of introductions and families and a shared meal in a good restaurant, had been its instrument. The kettle reached its note and she poured the water, and she carried the cup back to the low table and sat down again, and she held the warmth of it between both palms. The plan, he had told her, had worked. His former girlfriend had heard the news of the engagement and had said that she could not bear it, had said the words he had been hoping to hear for a long and restless time, and he had gone to her. She had been, from the very beginning, a letter written to someone else. She had been sent, and received, and set aside, and the whole of it had occurred without her knowledge, in a room she had never been permitted to enter. This thought arrived with a peculiar clarity, the way certain thoughts arrive at night when one is tired and unguarded, and she found that she did not immediately push it away but instead let it rest where it had landed, like a stone placed on a table, visible and present and requiring no response just yet. The rain fell on outside. The lamp burned its quiet amber. She drank her tea and sat with the weight of what she now knew, and the apartment held its breath around her. The night passed slowly, as long and difficult nights do, not with great events but with a slow and heavy turning of hours, and by the time the earliest light arrived at the edges of the curtains she had wept some and slept a little and arrived at something that was not yet clarity but was at least a kind of ground. She called her mother first, because her mother's voice was the voice she most needed in that early hour, and her mother listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and said very little when it was over, and said what she said with great care. Then she called her closest friend, the one who had been beside her when she chose the dress, the one who had laughed with her over the question of the table arrangements, and she told the story again, and again she was listened to with the full and generous attention of someone who understands that the telling is itself a kind of passage. In the days that followed she moved through a series of conversations that were each, in their own way, a weight to be carried and then set down, the calls to relatives, to friends, to the various people who had made plans around a date that would no longer hold any occasion. She apologized to each of them, quietly and sincerely, for the disruption to their preparations, for the gifts purchased and the travel arranged and the small invisible adjustments that people make when someone they love is to be married. And what she found, as she moved through these conversations, was something she had not expected. Not a single person, in all those calls and visits, offered her blame. They offered instead a steadiness of regard that she had not known she needed until she encountered it, a quality of presence that did not require her to manage her distress or perform her recovery. Some of them were quietly angry on her behalf, the contained and careful anger of people who have witnessed an unkindness and wish to name it without making the person who suffered it feel exposed, and she recognized this quality in their voices and found it, unexpectedly, a comfort. There were reports, in the days that followed, that some of her relatives had gone to express themselves directly to his parents, and she had not asked for this but did not discourage it, because she understood that the people who cared for her had their own responses to what had happened, and those responses were not hers to manage. She found herself thinking, in the quieter moments between one conversation and the next, about what it meant to have been used in the way that she had been used, and she was surprised to discover that the feeling arising most steadily in her was not shame but something more like a clear and focused anger that had a clean edge to it, that did not waver. It was a feeling she could work with. She understood this about it almost as soon as she recognized it. Her friends encouraged her to speak with someone who understood the legal dimensions of what had occurred, and one of them knew a lawyer, a quiet man with a calm office, an associate of her father's who had a reputation for asking careful questions and listening to the answers. She went to see him on a Tuesday afternoon, the city carrying on outside his window in its usual indifferent way, and she sat across the desk from him and told the full story, beginning with the arrangement and ending with the phone call, and he listened without rushing her. He explained, in the measured way of someone whose profession requires precision, that there were reasonable grounds for a claim, given the late nature of the cancellation, given the deposits and arrangements that could not now be recovered, given the preparations she had undertaken in good faith. And then there was, he noted quietly, the matter of her employment, the position she had held for many years, the salary that would have continued to arrive each month had she not been asked, in the belief that she was building a life with someone, to leave it behind. She had not thought of it in those terms before, had thought of it as a freely given sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice that love asks for and that one offers without keeping accounts, but sitting in that office with the afternoon light falling through the window she began to see it differently, as a loss with both a shape and a number. The lawyer's pen moved across the notepad, the amounts accumulating in neat figures, the venue cancellation at its full late rate, the travel arrangements, the bridal preparations, the 3 years of income, and when he added them together the total was larger than she had imagined, 10 million yen, or close to it. She sat with this number for a long moment, taking it in without quite reacting to it, the way one takes in an unexpected view from a hillside. They would prepare and send registered letters, what is called a nyo shomeisho, a formal legal notice arriving in an official envelope that carries the weight of the legal system behind it, one to him, at whatever address could be confirmed, and one to the former girlfriend whose presence had contributed to the ending of a wedding. The preparations took several days, and she went home and waited, and the waiting had a different quality than the waiting she had done when his phone went unanswered, because this waiting had a direction to it, a shape, a path she was following by choice and not by helplessness. The letters went out on a still morning in early summer, when the humidity had begun its patient annual climb and the air outside carried the green and faintly wet smell of the city after a long rain. She did not know immediately how they were received, but the days that followed had a quality of motion to them, of causes beginning to produce their effects in the slow and inevitable way of such things. The former girlfriend was the first to respond, reaching out through the lawyer's office, and when they sat together in the quiet meeting room, the woman across from her was not composed but frightened, her words arriving in a rush. She had not known, she said, she had been deceived as well. She was not responsible for what had been done. There was perhaps some truth in parts of this, and there was perhaps some incomplete accounting in other parts, and the full truth of what the former girlfriend had known or not known was not something that could be established with certainty, but what could be established was the recording she had kept, the telephone recording from that last call, in which he had described his own intentions plainly and without apparent concern for who might one day hear them. When the recording was played in that room, the former girlfriend became very still, her manner shifting the way the quality of light shifts when a cloud moves across the sun, gradually and then entirely. A resolution was reached, one that included a condition she had not expected the other woman to accept easily, which was that ending contact with him entirely was part of the arrangement, and yet the other woman accepted it, perhaps because she had by then a clearer understanding of the person she had been accepting back into her life. His own response came later and required more steps, more conversations, more patience, and ultimately the arrival one evening of his parents at her family home, where they bowed deeply and at length, with an apology that carried in it a quality of genuine remorse that their son's brief and careless words on the telephone had never approached. He was present at this meeting as well, but the words that needed saying were said by his father, who named what had been done clearly and without softening, and said that a person's life had been disrupted in a real and lasting way, and that this created an obligation. His parents undertook to cover what he himself could not pay. He did not, by this point, have the financial means he might once have had, his story having traveled through the professional community in which he had worked, passing from person to person among colleagues and supervisors who had been invited to a wedding that never took place, until the accumulation of what was known had made his position there no longer tenable. She had not arranged this outcome. She had simply told the truth to the people who had been affected by the events in question, and the truth had traveled the rest of the way on its own, as truth sometimes does when given room to move. And so the matter arrived, over the course of those weeks, at a kind of conclusion, not a single moment of resolution but a series of small closings, each one quieter than the last, like doors in a long corridor being gently shut. She did not think of it as a victory, because victory implied a contest that had been entered willingly, and what she had done was simply respond, as clearly and deliberately as she could, to something that had been done to her. What she felt, when the last of the formal proceedings had been concluded, was closer to the feeling of setting down something that had been heavy to carry, not triumph, but the quiet relief of having moved through a passage and arrived at air that was cleaner than what had come before. There were other feelings still ahead of her. She knew the grief of a future that had been imagined and would now take a different shape, the slow and patient work of learning to trust again, both in others and in the quiet evidence of her own instincts. But those things belonged to other days, to the long unfolding of time that was still ahead of her, still unwritten, still available in ways she could not yet see clearly. For now, it was enough to sit in the small room with the lamp burning low, the summer evening moving through the open window with its familiar smell of rain and warm pavement, and to allow the day to release her into something gentler. She found herself thinking, with a quiet and unhurried certainty, that the years ahead of her were still her own, and that thought, modest and true, was a thing worth resting in for a while. And so the night settled around her, and the lamp held its warmth, and somewhere in the city the rain continued its patient falling, and she let herself be still, and that, for this chapter, was how things came to rest. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows folding gently closed behind us, like the last page of a book set softly on a nightstand. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your breath slow, let your shoulders settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night is long and patient, and it will wait for you. When you are ready, Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, carried carefully across many years, the way you might carry something fragile through a darkened room, slowly, gently, with both hands. There is tenderness waiting there. We will find it together, in no rush at all. Somewhere in the soft middle of that particular March evening, on a night when city rain moved without hurry across the glass of his apartment window, the news he had been half expecting arrived in the form of a telephone call that lasted no more than a few quiet minutes. The voice on the other end was measured and polite, as voices tend to be when delivering news that has already been decided, and the message itself was brief. The arrangement had been formally concluded, the families had spoken, and the matter was now, for all practical purposes, closed. He sat for a moment after the call ended, the phone still warm in his hand, listening to the particular silence that follows a conversation that has changed the shape of things. Outside, the rain moved across the rooftops and the narrow lanes below, slow and indifferent, unaware of the small private endings that happen behind lit windows on ordinary evenings. He set the phone face down on the low table and looked at it there, at the plain softness of its unlit screen, and let the silence of the room settle around him the way silence does when there is nothing more left to say. His apartment was small and familiar, the kind of room a person fills slowly over years with objects that have stopped being noticed, a bookshelf with its quiet rows, a coat hung near the door, the faint smell of the older tatami mat in the corner where the lamplight never quite reached in the evenings. He rose after a while and moved to the kitchen alcove, opening the small refrigerator and standing before it without particular purpose, the cool air touching his face, before reaching past the usual things for the bottle of sake he had kept on hand without any reason he could now remember. He poured a small amount into a glass and brought it back to the table and sat down again, not because he especially wanted to drink, so much as because having something in his hands gave the evening a shape that was easier to hold. He thought of calling his parents, and then he did. His mother answered on the third ring, and he told her simply, and without embellishment, that the Miai had ended, that the other family had withdrawn, and that he was all right. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that contains much more than silence, and then his father's voice came on, low and steady, saying only that he understood, that these things sometimes happen, and that his son should not let it weigh too heavily. His mother, he could hear, was less composed. She had been allowing herself to imagine certain futures, had perhaps already mentioned things quietly to a neighbor or two, and the news settled through the telephone line like something physical, even without words to carry it fully. He said again that he was fine, that he was at home, that he would rest, and after a little more gentle conversation, the kind that moves in soft circles around the real difficulty, he said good night and set the phone on the table once more. The sake was mild and slightly cool, and he drank a small amount and set the glass down and looked at the rain against the window, which continued in its same unhurried manner, as if the evening had no particular feeling about any of it. There was a kind of loneliness in that hour that was different from ordinary loneliness, a loneliness with texture and weight, the sort that comes not from being alone in a room, but from having tried something carefully and then watching it come undone through no clear failure of one's own. He had tried carefully, he believed this, turning the thought over in his mind the way a person does when an outcome has disappointed them. He had chosen a legitimate path, had gone through the proper channels, had been patient and measured throughout all of it. And yet here was the evening, and here was the empty side of the table, and here was the sake in the glass going slowly toward room temperature. He thought, not for the first time that week, about the sequence of events that had brought him to this particular night, the phone call from the former girlfriend's mother, the interference that had followed, the letter that had arrived somewhere it should never have gone and changed the direction of things before he even knew it had been sent. He had learned, through the weeks of accumulating information, that the letter contained details about his past, about the 5-year relationship that had ended 2 years prior, about circumstances that had been reframed and presented in ways that were not entirely accurate, and that this letter had been enough to plant a seed of unease in a family that had not yet had sufficient time to build full trust. 3 months was not a long time to know someone, and not long enough for two families to become certain of each other, and so the letter had found its mark in that narrow window of vulnerability. He did not blame the other family. They had done what families do, which is to protect what matters most to them, and what mattered to them most was their daughter. He understood that, in the quiet part of himself that was past the immediate sadness, he understood it completely. He poured a second measure of sake, smaller than the first, and settled back against the cushion behind him, letting his shoulders release slowly, feeling the low tiredness that had been accumulating for weeks find somewhere to rest in the familiar softness of the room around him. The rain had slowed a little, or perhaps he simply noticed it less now, and the sound of it against the glass had become part of the room's texture, like the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional soft sound of a car passing on the wet street below. He found himself thinking about the woman he had hoped to marry, not with longing exactly, not the kind of longing that wants something returned, but with a quiet tenderness for the version of the future that had seemed briefly possible and now quietly would not happen. She had been thoughtful and gently humorous, and she had said something in one of their early conversations that had made him feel, yes, this is someone who considers things carefully, someone he could sit across from for a long time without the conversation feeling like effort. He hoped she was well, that the interference of the past weeks had not caused her too much distress, that the explanation given to her family had been clear enough to protect her dignity as much as his own. There was a small regret in having brought this situation into her life, into the life of her family, who had been nothing but gracious through the short time he had known them. She had not asked for any of it, and her family had been kind through a difficult period, and he intended to find a proper way to acknowledge that when the right moment came. For now, the evening continued in its quiet way, the sake making a small warmth in his chest, the rain outside settling into a finer and finer mist that was almost indistinguishable from the general softness of the night air. He thought of the conversation with the first lawyer, the one who had told him, with a kind of practiced weariness, that there was not much to be done without more concrete evidence, that the letter's origin could not be sufficiently proven, that he should consider the matter unfortunate but concluded. That advice had not satisfied him, and he had made another call that same afternoon, to a relative who understood the legal world better, who had suggested a different approach and a different office and a different way of thinking about what might still remain possible. But those were matters for tomorrow, and for the days that would follow tomorrow. Tonight was simply tonight, and tonight asked very little of him except to sit here in the lamp's warmth, and to let the sake do its small patient work. He had heard that week from the former girlfriend's closest friend, the one who seemed to stand, somehow, at the center of so much of the recent difficulty, that the former girlfriend was receiving some form of support, and that she was staying, at least for a time, with the friend rather than at her parents' home. He received this information with a complicated mixture of feelings that he did not entirely sort through, because sorting through them seemed like more effort than the evening warranted. He was simply, genuinely tired. He was tired in the particular way that comes from being attentive and careful for a very long time in a situation that kept changing shape beneath him, always one step ahead of whatever response he had managed to prepare. He thought, sitting there in the lamp's soft warmth, that he understood now why people described these situations as exhausting, not the strangeness of the drama itself, but the sustained vigilance it required, the constant quiet calculation of what to say and what to do and what to leave unsaid. He let some of that go now, in the particular permission that a difficult evening grants, the permission to be simply tired, simply sad, simply a person in a room with a glass and a window and rain that was nearly done falling. At some point later in the evening, he was not watching the clock, had deliberately set aside any watching of the clock. His phone on the table gave the small pulse of an arriving message. He looked at it without reaching for it immediately, the way a person looks at something they are not quite certain they want to encounter just yet, and then he picked it up and read the sender's name and felt the evening shift slightly around him. It was a message from the former girlfriend, the first direct communication from her in 2 full years, since the morning of the long goodbye, since the hug at the doorway and the words about good memories and meeting again someday with a smile. He set the sake glass down on the table very gently and read what she had written, and then he read it once more, because on the first reading he was not entirely certain he had understood what was being said. She had written that her period of depression had been caused by difficulties with her father, and not by the ending of their relationship, and she asked him to please not carry any guilt for that on her behalf. She had written that she knew her mother had been in contact with him, and that she was aware there had been other interference, though she said she had not known the full extent of what had been done in her name. She had written that she had no wish to resume any kind of relationship, that she believed she had behaved badly during the years they were together, particularly in how the ending had unfolded, and that she did not feel she deserved another chance with him even if one were offered. She had written that there was someone new in her life now, someone who had been present for her through the difficult months, and that she intended to build toward something with that person and to stop looking behind her at what had passed. She asked him, in the closing lines, to please find his own happiness, to not carry resentment toward the people who had cared for her, even if their methods had caused harm. He read these words in the dim light of the apartment, the rain having thinned to almost nothing outside, the city below gone to its particular late-night quiet. There was a photograph attached to the message. He had not expected this, a photograph of her and the person she had mentioned, taken somewhere with warm light, both of them looking toward the camera in the unguarded way that people look when someone they trust is holding the phone. He looked at the photograph for a moment, and then he set the phone face down on the table again, the way he had set it down after the earlier phone call, and he sat with what he was feeling, which was a complicated thing that did not resolve itself into any single name. There was anger somewhere in it, a slow and not particularly welcome anger, directed at the photograph itself, at the timing of the message, at the way the words had been arranged to seem generous while the photograph communicated something else entirely. There was also something like relief, something in him that recognized the finality, the door being closed firmly from the other side, which was in its way easier to accept than a door left open and uncertain. And underneath all of it, there was simply the tiredness. He sat for a while without moving, one hand resting on the low table beside the empty glass, the lamp making its warm and patient circle against the dark of the room. He thought about the 5 years, not cataloguing the events of 5 years, not itemizing the seasons of them, but holding them as a single weight and feeling the sum of it without needing to examine every part. They had been young together, mostly. She had been 22 when they first met, and he had still been young in the ways that matter, young in what he understood about the distance between what people intend to do and what they actually manage. He did not think badly of her, even now, even with the photograph face down on the table. He thought of her as someone caught between forces larger than herself, a difficult father, a mother who worried past what was useful, a sense of time that had begun to press on her in the 2 years since they had last spoken. He hoped, genuinely, that the person in the photograph made her happy, or at least tried to, which is what most people can honestly offer. He thought briefly about composing a reply, about finding some quiet and courteous response that might close the correspondence with a little grace, and then he decided against it, not from coldness but from the understanding that some things end more cleanly without a final word added to them. There would be other conversations to have in the days ahead, with lawyers and with the matchmaker and with his own family, and those conversations would need his attention and his steadiness, and he would give them both when the time came. Tonight, though, The apartment was quiet and the rain had nearly stopped, and the lamp on the table asked nothing of him except to sit within its circle a little while longer. He leaned back against the cushion and closed his eyes, not sleeping yet, not quite, but resting, letting the long accumulated tiredness of the day release slowly out of his shoulders and his hands. The sounds of the city at that hour were very soft, a distant train somewhere to the north, something that might have been wind moving through the narrow gap between buildings, the small and irregular drip of water from a rain gutter finding its way slowly down. He thought of his mother, who had been looking forward to things, and he felt for her a tenderness that was almost warm. Even through the difficulty of the evening, she had wanted something for him, and that wanting was its own kind of love, regardless of what the outcome had been able to manage. He thought that he would call her tomorrow, in the slow part of the afternoon, and talk about ordinary things for a while before perhaps saying something honest about how he was doing. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly and carefully, the way doors are closed well past midnight when the person closing them is trying not to disturb the quiet, and the sound moved briefly through the walls and then was absorbed back into the stillness. He opened his eyes and looked around at the room, his small and familiar room, the bookshelf and the coat and the faint smell of the tatami, the lamp in its patient place. It occurred to him, sitting there, that the worst of the difficulty was perhaps behind him now, not because the practical matters were resolved, because they were not yet, but because the shape of the situation had at last become clear, and clarity, even unwelcome clarity, is its own kind of rest. He knew now what had happened, and who had played a part in it, and what would need to be addressed, and knowing these things, even the hard ones, was quieter than the weeks of accumulating uncertainty that had come before this evening. He rose from the table and carried the glass to the kitchen and rinsed it under cold water and set it upside down on the small rack beside the sink. He stood for a moment with his hand resting on the counter, looking through the narrow kitchen window at the city lights below, which were still going about their ordinary business, indifferent and somehow comforting in exactly that indifference. He would sleep tonight, perhaps not deeply at first, perhaps not well at first, but eventually, the way sleep always arrives when the body has had enough of wakefulness and simply insists on its own need without asking permission. He returned to the room and turned off the lamp, and the darkness settled gently into the apartment, the ambient light from the city windows remaining as a pale and diffuse presence, touching the edges of familiar things without fully revealing them. He unfolded the futon from its place beside the wall and smoothed the cover with the flat of his palm, the cotton cool and familiar beneath his hand, smelling faintly of the clean and quiet smell he associated with rest. He lay down and pulled the cover over himself, settling into the futon's give, feeling the floor's slight steadiness beneath, the particular combination that was, in its own quiet way, one of the most reliable things he knew. The city outside continued its late-night existence, a few windows still lit in the buildings across the way, a sound from somewhere below that was too distant and too soft to identify, the last of the evening's rain finding its slow and unhurried path through the gutters. In the quiet of the room, in the pale wash of the city's indirect light, the long evening gradually began to release him, the phone call, the sake, the photograph, the words that had seemed generous but carried their edge regardless, all of it growing softer now, more distant, like a sound heard through the far side of a gently closing door. He thought, in the slow and drifting space before sleep comes, that tomorrow would be a different kind of day, not easier perhaps, but different, with the particular difference that comes when difficult things are finally named and held still, when the fog of not knowing has at last cleared away. And perhaps that was enough for one evening, to have sat with the difficulty, to have let it be what it was, to have drunk a small amount of sake beside a rain-touched window, and to have arrived, nonetheless, at the soft edge of sleep. And that, perhaps, is where this chapter of the story rests for tonight, in the quiet of a small room in March, with the rain finished and the city softly lit outside, and one man finding his way, as people always do, toward the quiet kindness of the next morning. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows settle quietly into the dark behind us, the way a door closes not with a click but with a soft, unhurried drift. There is no need to hold on to any of it now. If you feel the weight of sleep already pulling at the edges of your thoughts, that is perfectly fine, let it. Breathe in slowly, and out again, and feel the bed beneath you, solid and still. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle place, warm at its center, the kind of story that asks nothing of you but to listen. There is no rush. We are in no hurry here. Some afternoons settle over a person with a muffled, particular softness, the way a certain kind of winter light comes through the high glass panels of a shopping center and makes everything feel gently removed from ordinary time. He had been walking through one such afternoon with his wife at his side and his young daughter a step or two ahead, a small figure pausing at every illuminated window in the way children do when the world seems endlessly worth examining. The shopping center was the kind common in suburban Japan, wide corridors of polished tile, music woven low through the ventilated air, the smell of something warm and yeasty drifting from a bakery somewhere beyond the curve of the hall. He noticed her at a distance, before his mind had quite shaped a complete thought about her, in the way that a familiar melody will surface in a room before the listener can name the song. She was near the entrance of a small household goods store, and when she turned, he saw that she recognized him in the same moment he recognized her, something flickering across her face in the fluorescent light. His daughter had wandered toward the restrooms just then, his wife accompanying her with a hand on the small shoulder, and so he found himself standing alone in the wide corridor as the woman from his former life moved toward him. Looking at her as she approached, he noticed that the years had moved across her in ways that seemed to exceed the merely ordinary, that time had settled into her face and posture with a particular and visible weight. Her hair, which he remembered as always carefully maintained, had the loose, unattended quality of something addressed only when necessity became unavoidable. Her clothing sat on her without shape or intention, and she moved with a kind of heaviness that did not seem to belong to a woman still somewhere in her late 20s. There was something in her eyes as well, a quality of dimness, as though whatever had once lit them from within had been, over the course of several years, very gradually and quietly extinguished. She spoke first, beginning with the ordinary pleasantries that serve as bridges across difficult terrain, asking whether he had been well, whether work had been good, the careful tentative language of people who share a history they cannot quite face directly. He replied with the brief, measured courtesy of someone who has made a long and genuine peace with the past, keeping his answers without edges and without invitation. Then, as though the small talk had been only a path leading toward a door she had already decided to open, she told him that she had been thinking about the early years, about the time they had shared together. She said that she believed she had been happy then, or that she wanted to believe it, reaching back through memory for something that might still be held. She told him, in language that circled and returned to the same point several times, that she wanted to begin again, that perhaps the life they had once shared had been the right one, after all. He listened to all of this with the calm of someone who has rehearsed such a scene many times in imagination without ever quite expecting it to unfold in a shopping center corridor on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. He found himself thinking, with a kind of cool and distant clarity, that the woman standing before him had become nearly a stranger, that the years and everything done within them had placed a very great distance between who they had once been to each other. He told her, without drama and without unkindness, that he had remarried, that there was a child now, that his life had moved forward in every direction it was possible to move. He watched her face as the information arrived, the way one watches a person receive news they had perhaps, somewhere inside themselves, already expected but not yet made entirely real. The expression that crossed her face then was one he would remember for a long while afterward, not with satisfaction and not with grief, but in the way one remembers a significant shift in the sky, a change in the quality of the light before rain. Before anything further was said, he heard the soft footsteps of his daughter returning from the direction of the restrooms, the child moving toward him with the complete and unconditional trust that small children place in the steady arrangement of their world. His wife appeared a step behind the child, and the three of them gathered together in the corridor while the other woman understood, in that single and wordless arrangement of people, what had become of the life she had once walked away from. The expression that passed through her in that recognition was something he found difficult to witness, not because he felt guilt, which had long since dissolved, but because reckoning, even someone else's, has a heaviness that does not leave the surrounding air quickly. He steered his small family gently in another direction, exchanging only the briefest of farewells, and they continued their afternoon in the ordinary way, moving through the softly lit corridors while the bakery's warmth moved gently through the air around them. He did not speak of the encounter for most of the rest of the day, carrying the memory of it the way one carries something fragile, waiting for a quieter moment to set it down. That evening, while his daughter slept in the back of the house and the kitchen held its familiar smells of rice and the warm steam from a kettle, he told his wife about what had happened at the shopping center. He described it simply and without embellishment, and she listened without interrupting, her hands resting still on the counter, her attention entirely and unhurriedly present. He mentioned a faint unease that had remained with him since the encounter, a sense of something unfinished still moving somewhere in the background, and his wife told him quietly that she understood. Several days passed without anything further occurring, and the encounter settled gradually into the back of his mind among the many things that had happened and were now simply part of what had been. He was careful not to give it more weight than it deserved, understanding that to dwell would be to allow something small to occupy more space than it had earned. He was aware, in those days, of how much had changed since the divorce, of the particular warmth of the house he returned to in the evenings, of the small daily rituals that hold a family together like the careful stitching of a well-made garment. The steadiness of the life he and his wife had built together had become something he noticed and was quietly grateful for, in ways he had not always taken the time to acknowledge. It was on an ordinary evening some weeks after the shopping center encounter, the light outside having gone the flat pale grey of late afternoon, that the knock came at the front door. His mother, who shared the household in the unhurried and practical way of Japanese families where proximity and mutual care are simply assumed rather than arranged, was first to answer. He heard voices from the other room, and something in the quality of one of them made him set down what he had been holding and go to see. The woman from the shopping center was standing in the entryway of his home, and something about her bearing had shifted since their meeting in the corridor, a different quality to her presence now, less composed and more insistent. She had come, she said, because she had nowhere else to go, because the life she had been living since the divorce had become something she could no longer manage on her own. She spoke at length about the household she had been a part of, about the man she had gone to after the divorce, and about the daily texture of that life in terms that he found neither surprising nor easy to sit with. She described days structured entirely around the demands of others, labor expected without acknowledgement, and a man who had become, across the slow accumulation of years, a person very different from what she had once imagined him to be. Her voice as she spoke carried a flat, worn quality, the sound of someone who has been unhappy for a long time and has half forgotten what the alternative felt like. He stood at a careful distance in the entryway, aware of his daughter moving somewhere in the back of the house, aware of his wife in the other room, aware of the particular strangeness of this conversation occurring in this place. He listened because it seemed discourteous not to, and because he understood that she had perhaps nowhere else to bring this. As he listened, He found himself thinking that the story she was telling had arrived where it was through a long series of decisions that had been entirely her own, made in circumstances she had in some sense been the author of. This did not make her suffering less real, but it placed that suffering in a territory that lay outside the boundary of what he could properly be asked to enter. He told her, with all the steadiness he had in him, that he was sorry to hear of her difficulties, that he sincerely wished her well in working through them, but that what she was asking was not something he was in a position to give. She pressed further, and it was in this pressing that something in her reasoning began to travel in a direction that none of the people in the room had quite prepared themselves for. She spoke of the house they were standing in, suggesting, in a tone that carried an extraordinary absence of self-awareness, that it might reasonably be sold to address certain difficulties she had described. And then she said something further regarding the child, his daughter sleeping a few rooms away, the implication being that if such arrangements would simplify matters, the child might perhaps be raised by his current wife alone, as though this were a natural and reasonable thing to propose. The silence that followed was long enough and dense enough to have its own particular texture, a collective stillness that settled over the entryway like something poured slowly into the space. His mother, a woman who had lived through a great deal and who rarely allowed herself to be visibly disarranged, stood completely still for a moment, as though she required additional time to confirm what she had heard. His wife had entered the room quietly at some point during the conversation, and she, too, had gone entirely still. The woman who had spoken seemed not fully aware of the quality of the silence she had produced, and this absence of awareness was, in its own way, as arresting as anything she had said. He found himself thinking, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes at the very end of a prolonged confusion, that he was grateful, in a way that reached all the way through him, for the path his life had taken and not the other. His mother was the first to find words, speaking with the measured, unhurried authority of someone who has decided that a matter must be concluded without drama or prolonged discussion. The woman was asked to leave, and she went, and the front door was closed, and the house returned to its evening in the way that rooms do return, gradually, the way warmth comes back into a space after the cold has been shut out. His daughter slept through all of it, undisturbed in the room at the back of the house, and this seemed to everyone present to be the only fully right thing about the evening. Later, when the household had quieted and both his daughter and his mother had retired, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cool between his hands. The kettle on the counter ticked softly as the metal contracted in the quiet, and outside the window the neighborhood had settled into its late evening stillness, the house lights warm and muted behind glass, the very distant sound of a passing car moving through the streets and then fading entirely. He thought about the woman who had stood in his entryway, and about the woman he had once been married to, who had at one time also been her, and about the very great distance between those two things. He considered what she had described of her current life, the household, the daily labor, the weight of years she had not arranged well, and he understood, without pleasure in the understanding, that certain choices carry their consequences silently within them from the very beginning. There was something genuinely sad in the distance between who she had been when he first knew her and what she had described of herself now, and he allowed himself to feel that sadness briefly, without indulging it, the way one acknowledges a passing cloud without following it across the sky. He was not glad of her unhappiness, precisely, but he was aware of the distance between where she was and where he was, and that distance felt, in the quiet of the kitchen, very wide and very clear. He thought about his daughter's face as she had drifted to sleep that evening, her breath settling into its long and even rhythm, the simple and ordinary miracle of a child at peace in the dark. He thought about his wife in the other room, the particular steadiness of her presence in his life, and the thought of her had the quality of something solid and reliable, the kind of weight that holds rather than presses. He decided, before he rose to turn off the kitchen light, that he would visit the other man's family in the morning, not in anger, which had resolved itself a long time ago, but simply to say, in a plain and measured way, that visits to his home were not something he was willing to have continue. This seemed to him the correct and unhurried thing to do, the kind of action one takes not out of vengeance but out of the ordinary and reasonable care of one's household and the people within it. Having decided it, he felt something settle inside him, the way a drawer pushed at last all the way closed makes its small final sound and rests. He rose, turned off the light, and moved through the familiar dark of the hallway toward the back of the house, past his daughter's door where the quiet was as complete as quiet ever is. He lay down in the dark and listened for a while to the almost sounds of the sleeping house, the faint old voice of the walls, the very distant murmur of the city somewhere beyond. The warmth of the futon settled around him in that particular way of Japanese beds warmed through the early evening hours, and the weight of the blanket was precise and good, a familiar pressure. He found himself thinking, without urgency, that the ordinary is not, as it is sometimes supposed to be, the opposite of happiness, but something that moves very close alongside it, nearly indistinguishable in the quiet dark. A life of no particular drama, evenings that ended in warmth and stillness, a small child sleeping without a troubled dream in the next room, none of this, he thought, was a small thing. Sleep arrived in the way it does when a decision has been made and settled, and the mind no longer needs to hold anything carefully at the ready. And that was where the fifth part of this story came to rest for the night, quietly, in the dark of a house where everyone present was, in every way that mattered, exactly where they were meant to be. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way all hallways do into quiet, into shadow, into the soft forgetting that sleep allows. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm, in through the nose, a long and gentle out, your body heavier against whatever holds it. The stories will wait for you. They always do. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, not a painful one, but tender, the kind that surfaces in half-sleep like a face glimpsed through still water. Settle a little deeper. You are safe here, and there is nowhere else to be. She had been still for so many mornings now, and he had noticed it from the first, the way her usual warmth had lowered itself to something quiet and inward, like a lamp turned to its smallest setting. The autumn had arrived in the way it always did in that part of the country, in long slow gradations of color, the maples outside the school windows going from green to yellow to a papery, muted rust that caught the afternoon light and held it softly. She had always moved through the school with an ease that seemed natural to her, smiling at people in the hallways, filling whatever room she occupied with a kind of lightness that others simply responded to without needing to think about it. But since the tournament had ended, since the last serve of her last match in the final season of her school badminton career, something in her had grown slow and heavy, like weather moving in from somewhere far away. He had been watching her from across the classroom, as he had always watched her, from the distance he had always maintained, and he had been wondering for some time whether anyone was going to say something to her, whether anyone was going to ask if she was all right. The days continued, and no one seemed to say anything that reached her, because the heaviness remained, and her sighs during the afternoon lessons were quiet but audible, and he noticed every one of them from his seat near the back of the room. He had told himself many times that it was not his place to speak to her. He had said this to himself with some firmness, because he had learned over the years of high school that certain distances, once established, are best respected. But she was sad in a way he had not seen before, not just tired or disappointed, which were ordinary things, but something deeper, something that did not lift after a few days the way ordinary sadness does. The afternoon when it happened was ordinary in most respects. He was the last one left in the classroom, collecting something from his desk, and when he looked up he realized that she was still there too, sitting by the window with her chin resting in her hand. The other students had gone, and the sounds of the school at that hour drifted in from elsewhere, distant voices, the muffled rhythm of a sports club in the gymnasium, but the classroom itself was quiet, the golden light of late afternoon lying across the rows of empty desks. She was looking at the maple tree in the school courtyard, and she did not notice him at first, and he stood there for a moment in the stillness between speaking and not speaking, holding the question he had been carrying for several weeks. He gathered himself and asked if she was all right, and the words came out simply, without elaborate framing, just the plain question, because he found that it was the only thing he had that seemed honest to the moment. She turned from the window and looked at him, and something moved across her face before she composed it into an expression of reassurance, smoothing the edge of her skirt with one hand, tilting her head in the way people do when they are trying to appear less affected than they are. She said she was fine, that he should not worry, that she was sorry if she had been making the air around her heavier than it needed to be, and her voice was steady and polite, as it always was when she was managing something. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that she did not need to apologize, that he was only asking because he had noticed, and that she did not have to speak about it if she did not want to, but that she should at least know someone had been paying attention. He told her, in a way that came out less smoothly than he had intended, that she seemed more like herself when she was at ease, that the classroom felt different without her usual brightness in it, and he heard himself say this and felt the particular exposure of having said more than he had planned to. She looked at him for a moment with something that might have been surprise, and then she gave a small, involuntary laugh, a brief and genuine sound, as if something had arrived in the room that she had not been expecting. The laugh lasted only a moment. Then she raised one hand to cover her mouth, as she often did, and then the other hand came up, and she pressed both hands against her face, and her shoulders began to move in a way that was not laughter. She was crying. Not loudly, and not with any display, but in the quiet way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has decided, in this particular moment and without quite choosing to stop. He stood very still, and he felt the particular helplessness of someone who wants to help and does not know how, and he asked quietly whether he had said something wrong, whether he had been thoughtless, whether there was anything at all that he could do. She shook her head and kept her face in her hands, and he waited, because there was nothing else to do, because the room was very still around them and waiting seemed like the most honest thing available. After a while she lowered her hands and looked at him with eyes that were bright and a little reddened, and the steadiness of her gaze was something he would remember later, that particular quality of someone who has decided to be honest regardless of what honesty might cost. She asked whether he still liked her. The words settled into the room like something very small and very solid being placed on a table. They did not move. They simply were there, and then the silence that followed them was complete. He thought for a moment that he had misheard her. He thought perhaps the strange light of the afternoon and the emotion of the scene had made him hear what some private part of him had always wished someone would say. He stood without answering. She told him that she had been struggling with more than just the tournament. That she had been carrying something for a very long time, something that had the particular weight of waiting without knowing for certain what one was waiting for. She told him about the yearbook. She said that on the morning of their middle school graduation, while he had been writing something in her yearbook, she had been writing something in his, and she had meant what she wrote, and she had written it clearly, because she had wanted there to be no mistake about it. She had written that she liked him. She had written it and meant it, and then she had put the yearbook back among his things, and she had waited for him to read it and say something in return. She had waited through the summer. She had waited through the first months of high school, and through the first year, and the second year, and now into the third, and there had been no response, and she had eventually concluded that he had read it and chosen not to say anything, which was a kind of answer in itself. She had tried to let it go. She had told herself it was finished, that she had misread things, that what she thought she had heard in the photography club room on the afternoon of graduation had been nothing more than the imagination of someone who wanted too much to believe something. But then he had spoken to her recently, with a concern in his voice that she had not been prepared for, and the feelings she had set down so carefully had simply picked themselves back up, and she had not known what to do with them. He felt the warmth leave his face slowly, the way warmth leaves a room when an unseen window has been left open on a cold evening. He had never opened the yearbook. Not once in 3 years. It was in a box at the back of the closet at home, placed there on the day he received it and never touched since. His middle school years had not been unkind, but they were not years he had wished to return to, and the yearbook had seemed to him like a record of something best left undisturbed. He had not imagined, not even at the furthest reach of any of his daydreaming, that she might have left something there for him. The possibility had not occurred to him. He told her he was sorry. He said it plainly and with the full weight of the understanding that had arrived in him, the understanding of 3 years passing while something true sat quietly waiting in the darkness of a closed book in a closed closet. He said that he genuinely had not known, that he had put the yearbook away because those years had not been ones he had wished to revisit, and that it had nothing to do with her, and that if he had known, but here he let the sentence go unfinished, because finishing it seemed to ask for something that could not be returned. She watched him as he said this, and something in her expression softened, something that had been held at a careful distance came a little closer, and her hands, which had been pressed together in her lap, came still. She asked whether she could say it again now, since he had not heard it the first time. He said yes. She told him she had liked him for a long time. Since elementary school, she believed, since a morning she remembered only softly, when she had been newly transferred and did not know anyone, and a boy had come over to where she was sitting alone near the playground equipment and asked if she wanted to come and play. He had a faint and uncertain memory of something like that, the kind of memory that is more feeling than fact, assembled from something overheard or half-imagined rather than clearly seen, but she was smiling now as she described it, a real smile, the one he had spent years watching from a careful distance. He said that he had liked her too. He said it simply, without decoration. He had liked her since middle school and had never stopped, and the simplicity of saying it now, in this room, to her face, was something he had not known how to imagine before this moment. She looked at him for a long while without speaking, and the afternoon light lay between them and around them, and the maple tree outside the window was very still. He stepped toward her, and he put his arms around her, carefully, and she let him, and they stood like that for a while in the quiet classroom, with the distant sound of someone practicing scales on a piano somewhere in the music wing drifting faintly through the half-open door. She said, after a while, that he did not need to go home and find the yearbook now, that it was embarrassing in retrospect, that she had been younger when she wrote it and the wording was probably very earnest. He said that he was going to read it anyway, and she laughed a little at that. The room was dimming. Outside, the leaves of the maple were very still, and the school was settling into its late afternoon quiet around them. He found the yearbook that evening, at the back of a box at the top of the closet, its spine uncracked, its pages still holding the faint smell of old printing, something dry and faintly sweet, the smell of a thing that has been waiting a long time in the dark. He carried it to his desk and sat down with it and opened it slowly, past the class photographs with their rows of carefully combed hair and serious young expressions, past the teacher's messages and the photographs of club activities, until he found the page where she had written. The words were in her neat and deliberate handwriting, the way someone's handwriting looks when they are writing something that matters to them, each letter placed with a small extra care. She had said that she had noticed him. She had said that she hoped they might speak more in the years to come. He read it twice. Then he closed the yearbook and sat for a while with it resting in his hands, in the quiet of his room, while the sounds of his family's house moved around him at a comfortable distance, his mother in the kitchen, the low murmur of the television from the next room. The feeling that came over him then was not quite relief and not quite regret, but something that contained both of them and also something else, something more like understanding, like the moment when a long confusing thing finally resolves itself into a shape that makes sense. He had liked her. She had liked him. For all those years, both of them watching from a distance, neither of them knowing that the other was doing the same thing. He sat with that for a while, in the particular stillness of an autumn evening in a small room, and eventually he put the yearbook somewhere more accessible now, somewhere it would not need to be kept at a distance anymore. Their friendship deepened through the winter and into spring, in the slow and unhurried way of things that are not forced, and then into something that had no easy name in its early stages but was warm and consistent and moved at its own pace. She recovered her brightness gradually, as people do when something they have been waiting for arrives at last, the weight lifting slowly, over weeks and then months, and the ease she had always carried with her returning, softer now but more genuinely hers than it had perhaps ever been. They studied for their university entrance examinations, sometimes in the same library at neighboring tables, not always speaking but sharing the quiet in a way that both of them seemed to find steadying, and they passed their examinations and enrolled at the same university, a fact that neither of them discussed as a decision, though in some sense it was. The university years were freer and larger than high school had been, and they moved through them together with the particular pleasure of people who have discovered, quite without planning to, that they are well suited to each other's company. He met her family in the way that such things happen, gradually and then naturally and then regularly, and her parents were warm and ordinary, and her father had a habit of falling asleep in the armchair after dinner in a way that made the house feel very settled and at ease with itself. The years passed in the way that good years do, each one leaving a general impression of warmth and steadiness rather than a catalogue of events, and she became as known to him as anything in his life, as present and as ordinary as the changing of seasons. When he was 25, they were married, at a small ceremony in the middle of summer, with both their families present, and what he remembered most of that day was not the ceremony itself but the look on her face when it was over, a look that held in it all the years they had circled around each other without knowing, and all the years still ahead. When old classmates heard the news, there was the kind of surprise that greets things that are both unexpected and somehow, in hindsight, entirely right, and some of them said they had not seen it coming, and others said that, thinking about it now, perhaps they had. He understood both reactions. He was still, in some small way, surprised himself not by her, and not by the life they had made together, but by the particular path the story had taken, by the yearbook and the closed closet and the graduation morning and the 3 years and the quiet autumn afternoon. The story had needed all of those things, it seemed. The misunderstandings, the silences, the long seasons of watching from a distance. Each of them had played their small and necessary part. And now, in the years that followed, when he thought of any of it, the photography club room, the morning of the graduation ceremony, the long high school afternoons, it was with the gentle, slightly wondering feeling of someone who has come through something that might have gone differently, and is glad that it did not. She had sat with her feelings for a very long time, tending them with a patience he found, even now, difficult to fully comprehend, and he had spent 3 years with her words sitting in a closed book in a closet, and somehow, in the end, the distance had been crossed. Not by a single grand gesture, and not by anything dramatic, but by an ordinary afternoon and a question asked quietly in a classroom going golden in the last of the day's light, and an answer that had always been there, had always been true, had simply needed a moment in which to be spoken aloud. She had waited. He had not known, all that time, that she was waiting. And yet the story had found its way to where it needed to be, with the unhurried patience of things that are meant to settle gently and to rest. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in the quiet space between what almost was not, and all the warmth of everything that followed. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it grow quiet and distant, the way all memories do when we stop holding them so tightly. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, breathe slowly, feel the weight of your body settle a little deeper into where you are resting, and know that nothing is asking anything of you right now. The night is patient. The darkness around you is gentle. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a soft, unhurried thing, the kind that lives in ordinary afternoons and the particular way light used to fall through a certain window a long time ago. She sent him only a single word, and when he saw it on his phone that morning, he sat very still for a long while, the room around him quiet, washed in the soft light of a November morning. She had written nothing but his name, one syllable, his name alone, and that small word, arriving after months of silence, meant something he did not try to translate into other language, simply holding it the way one holds a very small warm thing. He left in the middle of the afternoon, when the light had shifted to the long, low quality that November brings to Japanese cities, and walked through streets grown familiar over many months of this same quiet journey. The walk to the hospital was known to him now, the convenience store at the corner where he sometimes bought something small to bring, the narrow lane that held the smell of wood smoke on cold afternoons, the low stone wall with the persimmon tree leaning gently over it. He had made this same walk many dozens of times since late summer. Each time he had arrived at the glass entrance and learned, gently and without drama, that she was not receiving visitors that afternoon, and he had accepted this without argument, without making any scene of it. Some afternoons he had waited in the lobby for a time, sitting in a plastic chair near a window with a small paper cup of tea from the vending machine by the elevators, watching the slow and quiet movement of hospital life through the pale corridor beyond. He had left things at the nurse's station when she would not come out, a soft cotton blanket folded into a paper bag, a pair of thick socks tucked into a pale envelope with her name written carefully on the front, once a small book he placed there without any note inside. He had not known whether any of these things ever reached her hands, and the not knowing had its own particular texture, neither unbearable nor comfortable, simply the texture of waiting when waiting is all that is available to you. The glass doors at the side of the building opened onto the small courtyard garden. He pushed through them on this particular afternoon and stepped into the cool air, and she was there, near the low stone path, sitting in her wheelchair beside a cluster of dried ornamental grasses that moved softly in the November wind. She was facing away from him, her face turned slightly toward the bare persimmon tree at the garden's edge, her posture calm and very still in the way of someone who has grown accustomed to long hours of quiet contemplation. Across her lap was the cotton blanket he had sent, spread wide, soft to the touch, and on her feet, visible beneath the blanket's edge, were the thick socks he had enclosed in the pale envelope many weeks before. He stopped walking when he saw these things. The sight of them settled somewhere in his chest in a way he had not prepared for, and for a moment the garden around him was perfectly still, only the dried grasses whispering to themselves in the wind. She heard him, or perhaps sensed his presence in the way that people sometimes sense those they have known across a very long span of time, and she looked up, and her face moved through several things at once: recognition, a certain careful wariness, and beneath both of these, a softness she made no effort to conceal. He said something ordinary by way of greeting, something old acquaintances use when they have been apart for a while and are carefully feeling their way back toward each other, and she replied with a small sound of acknowledgement that was warmer than any particular word could have been. He sat down on the nearby bench, leaving appropriate distance between them, and the afternoon light fell in a long pale stripe across the grey stone between their feet. Neither of them said very much at first. She asked how he was, and he said he was well enough, that the new job was finding its rhythm, that he was adjusting to adult working life as most people do in their mid-20s, slowly and with a certain amount of improvisation. She nodded and looked back out toward the grasses, and her profile in the low light had the quality of someone who has spent a considerable amount of time inside their own thoughts, calm and slightly turned inward, accustomed now to the interior. Around them the garden held its small sounds, the dry whisper of the ornamental grasses, the faint mechanical hum of the building's ventilation somewhere above, the distant sound of a vehicle passing on the road beyond the hospital wall. He noticed that she had grown somewhat thinner than he remembered, that her hands resting quietly in her lap had a particular stillness to them, that she held herself with the careful and deliberate posture of someone who has learned to listen closely to their own body. The wheelchair was simply present between them the way certain facts come to simply be present, without the drama of their first arrival, absorbed now into the fabric of the ordinary, the way any significant thing eventually becomes ordinary if you sit with it long enough. He had spent months preparing what he would say if she ever agreed to see him again, and now that the moment had arrived, none of those prepared words felt quite right. They felt too arranged, too deliberate for an afternoon that was asking for something simpler. He told her, in plain and unhurried language, that he had something he needed to say, and asked if she would listen, and the way he said it, his voice lower than usual, his hands folded together in his lap, made the weight of the request clear without overstating it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said yes. Her expression had the quality of someone who knows that a certain conversation has been waiting to arrive, and who has come to a kind of readiness for it, the way one comes to readiness for things that have been waited for across a very long time. He began not from the months at this hospital, not from the accident or the party in the rain, but from much further back, from the time before either of them had quite become themselves, when the neighborhood was still the whole of the known world. He told her about the candy shop, about his grandmother's gentle habit of drawing the children who came in toward the small boy who had not yet learned how to make friends on his own, and about a girl with neat dark hair who had arrived one afternoon with her mother to buy something small. He told her about learning to track her presence across a schoolyard before he had understood what that particular kind of tracking meant, about the way he had always been aware of where she was in any shared space without having consciously decided to be. He described the teasing, the way boys of that age fill the space between themselves and someone they cannot bring themselves to simply be honest with, the constant small agitations, the borrowed erasers not returned, the minor and persistent provocations. He mentioned the lunch bag, swung carelessly on a particular afternoon, the contact it had made with her face, the way she had cried afterward, and the completeness of the shame that had followed him home that day and settled into the evening. He told her about the joint class sessions in elementary school, about standing at the back of the room watching her laugh with the other children, about memorizing the particular quality of her laughter without having made any decision to. He spoke about middle school, she in the art club with its smell of paint and paper, he in the basketball gymnasium with its smell of floor wax and effort, and about the way news of her reached him sometimes through the quiet channels of a small community. He told her about the morning of her graduation from middle school, about finding her in the school corridor, about saying the thing he had said in a voice that cracked toward the end without asking his permission. He told her about waiting beside the telephone that evening, about the slow drift into sleep while sitting in his chair, about being woken by his mother, about the call when it came and the words that were exchanged and the soft sound of the line going quiet at the end. He told her about the December street, 3 years after that, the cold afternoon air, the unexpected sight of her after a long absence, the words that left his mouth before he had decided to say them. He told her about the party in the rain, the way she had walked in looking exactly as she always looked, smaller than he remembered and then immediately exactly right, and about the news she had shared near the end of that long evening, and about sitting very still to receive it. He did not linger on what had followed the party, the months of it, the hospital room visit, the moment of his worst behavior and its consequence, moving through that time in a few quiet sentences, acknowledgement rather than account, summary rather than detail. He told her instead about the lobby, about the plastic chair by the window, about the paper cups of vending machine tea, about the small packages left at the nurse's station with her name written carefully on the outside in his handwriting. He told her about a drawer in his childhood bedroom where he had kept a photograph from a neighborhood summer festival and a short note she had once written him, kept not as trophies, but simply as evidence of something he had not wanted to lose track of. He told her that he had kept coming not because he was certain of anything, but because the feeling had been there for as long as he could remember, steady and undemanding as the sound of rain on a roof at night, without conditions, and without any demand to be more than what it was. He said that he was not saying any of this in expectation of a particular response, that he was not looking for anything except this, to have the words finally outside of him rather than inside, after all these years of carrying them. And then he stopped, because there was nothing more to add. The garden held its silence around them, the dried grasses making their soft and patient sound, the afternoon light fully golden now and beginning its long quiet decline toward evening. She was crying when he looked up, not dramatically, but in the way that tears come when something finds a place that has been waiting a very long time to be found, the tears arriving slowly, with a kind of surprised and private dignity. He was crying too, he noticed, had been for some time without quite registering it, and neither of them made any effort to stop or to compose themselves for the other person's benefit. The silence that settled between them was not empty, it had the weight of what had just been said, and of the long years before the saying, and it felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly the right size for everything it was holding. Then she said that she had always known, on some level, what his presence across those years had meant, that she had felt it even from a distance, even when she had been careful not to turn and look at it directly. She said that the constancy of it had sometimes been frightening, because to be cared for in that particular way asks something of you in return, asks you to be worth it, and she had not always been certain that she knew how to be. She said that she had kept a careful distance sometimes, not from indifference but from its opposite, from not trusting herself to be sensible about him when he was close enough to matter. And then she said the thing that had not yet been said it in her direct and undecorated way, without ceremony, that she liked him, that she had always liked him, using the same simple and serious word he had used at the school gate all those years ago. He said that he liked her too. The simplicity of the exchange, two people who had reached their mid-20s using the word that children use for the most serious things, felt entirely right, uncluttered by the years that had accumulated between the first possible saying and this one. They sat together in the cooling garden for a long while after that, not speaking very much, the blanket across her lap, the last of the afternoon light moving slowly across the stones between their feet. A nurse appeared at some point in the glass doorway, looked out at them with a brief and calm professional assessment, and withdrew again without disturbing anything, understanding that nothing was needed. The sparrow that had been moving through the branches of the small bare tree at the garden's edge eventually came to rest on the rim of a stone planter, its small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and was still. She told him, in a quiet, unhurried voice, that the rehabilitation was going slowly but that she had found her way to a kind of patience with the pace of it, that there were good days and quieter days, and she had learned over time to value both kinds equally. He said he would like to come more often, and she considered this for a moment and said he could come several times a week, not every day, but several times, and the small practical negotiation of it made them both exhale in something that was very close to ease. He understood, from the particular texture of that moment, that they were at the beginning of something, and that this beginning would not arrive with ceremony or announcement but would simply accumulate, the way all durable things accumulate, quietly, in the unremarkable hours. In the weeks that followed, the hospital became a different kind of familiar, not the familiar of waiting to be admitted, but the familiar of belonging, of being expected, of being known by name at the desk, of having a particular chair that was understood to be his. He learned the rhythms of her days there when the rehabilitation sessions ended, which hours left her most tired, which side of the building held the better afternoon light, which of the nurses she found it easiest to work with. She told him stories during those visits that he had not known, accounts from the years when their paths had not crossed, small incidents and observations, the way she thought about things, which had always had a certain quiet and practical directness to it. He listened to all of them with the same quality of attention he had always given to anything that concerned her, and she was aware of the listening now, and he no longer needed to conceal it. The rehabilitation moved in increments too small to observe from one afternoon to the next, but across weeks and then months the increments assembled into something visible, and he was present for the unremarkable afternoons that constituted the texture of its progress. He was saving money by now with a more particular purpose beginning to form, carefully and without any particular urgency, understanding that the right moment would indicate itself when it arrived, and that his task until then was simply to be prepared. His parents had come to understand, over the course of the year, the nature of what was unfolding, his father saying one evening, in the direct and uncomplicated way he communicated the things that mattered most, that if a decision had been made, then the only remaining task was to mean it completely, without holding anything in reserve. He thought about his father's words often, on the train home from the hospital, watching the city move past the dark windows in streaks of amber and pale white light, and found them to be among the most useful things anyone had ever said to him. The seasons continued their movement, winter settling the city under cold blue skies, mornings where frost appeared on the window glass and the air outside held nothing but cold and the faint smell of bare ground and distant wood smoke. She remained at the rehabilitation center through much of the winter and into the following spring, working with her therapists through the patient and repetitive processes that the body requires when it is learning itself again after a significant disruption. He brought small things when he came, a book she had mentioned wanting to read, something sweet from a shop near his office, hand warmers in the colder months, a small potted plant for her windowsill when spring arrived and the quality of the light changed. She received these things in the way she received most things, without fuss or elaborate acknowledgement, with a direct and simple gratitude that expressed itself in her expression rather than in formal words. They talked about the future sometimes in the careful tentative way that people do when the future is real but still forming, not making large promises, sketching only the general shape of what they hoped, which was ordinary and domestic, and which was enough. She spoke sometimes about what she hoped to be able to do when she eventually left the center, the small freedoms that become visible only in their absence, the cooking and the walking and the simple liberty of going somewhere for no particular reason at all. He thought often about how different the shape of all this was from anything he might have imagined at 17, and how much more precisely itself it felt, how much more fully real than any version of it he could have deliberately planned. He had not foreseen any part of it, not the long middle years of careful distance, not the accident, not the garden in November with the blanket spread across her lap and the socks he had sent on her feet, and yet looking back at the sequence, he could not imagine any other path having led to this particular place. The 15 years had been accumulation, he understood, not wasted time, but the slow gathering of a particular kind of knowing, the knowledge of how to be steady when something asks for steadiness, of how to remain simply present without demanding that the present be different from what it is. She told him once, near the end of a long ordinary visit on a weekday afternoon, that he was the only person in her life who had never made her feel that the slowness of things was a problem requiring a solution. He carried this with him on the train home that evening, the city moving past the dark windows, and felt something in himself settle into a stillness that had not always been accessible, a quiet that belonged there, that had finally found the right place to rest. There would be a day, he was certain, when he would say the other thing he was carrying, not yet, because the moment had not yet indicated itself, but coming, sometime, in some quiet setting not entirely unlike the one where this had all begun. For now there was only this, the evening visits, the small gifts, the conversations that ranged across many years and then returned always to the present, the particular and ordinary quality of being genuinely part of someone's daily life. He would say, if anyone were ever to ask him in some later year what the long years of waiting had felt like, that it had felt like tending something in the patient and unhurried way that things worth tending require, without demanding that they hurry, without ever threatening to stop. And that is where the story rests tonight, in the quiet of a Japanese autumn, in a small hospital garden with dried grasses and a bare persimmon tree, two people who had always known, finding their way at last to the beginning that had been waiting for them all along, and that was enough. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. The voices have quieted now, the last thread of each tale left to settle gently into the dark, like leaves coming to rest on still water.